Please put your hands together and give a very warm welcome to Ross Stack from Soundcuts.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank Develop Talk for having me and accommodating my needs for a bigger stage. So yeah, thank you. This talk is about, this game is Dusk Falls, the unique challenge of audio and interactive storytelling, and hopefully I'll cover some of the both technical and creative challenges we faced along the way. So, getting started. About me, my name is Ross Stack. I consider myself at this point probably an audio generalist. I've tried everything from live sound to some VO and some audio programming, and I'm terrible at everything. But at this point, I'm probably just a sound designer. I've got about 15 years of experience in audio in some shape or form or another. I've got a background in post-production, and then I transitioned into game audio, about 8 years ago. Currently, we're working for Soundcuts remotely from my studio in Ireland, and before that, I used to work for Frontier Developments. Here's just a small selection of some of the projects that I've worked on throughout the years. A bit about Soundcuts. It's a production company founded in 2011 by Adele. I'm sure many of you know Adele. At this point, we've worked on over 100 projects to date and counting. We've got a core team of about 10 people, and then that can expand to up to 20 if needs arise. On this project, we had roughly about 4 people at any one time, and that once again expanded and contracted as well, depending on deadlines, etc. And our motto is all things audio, so we provide everything, for your game, film, TV show, trailer, advert, you name it, we'll do it. And one of the things that we're quite proud of is that we can kind of provide essentially an in-house audio team for studios that may not have those services on site. And one of the things that we say is the more that a team can give us as outsources, the more we can give back. And that was very much the case here with Interior Night, is they kind of gave us the keys to the Cadillac, so to speak, and we're very much integrated into their team. So a bit about Interior Night. They're an independent game studio founded by Caroline Marshall, former lead designer of games like Heavy Rain, Beyond Two Souls, very narrative-led games. Studio is a mix of kind of award-winning kind of industry veterans and also a lot of emerging talent as well. And their whole focus is, games that kind of are at the crossroads between, television and video games, with the view to kind of bring in both players and, people from all kind of walks of life. As Dusk Falls is their first game, it's an interactive drama. It explores kind of the entangled lives of 2 families across a span of about 30 years. And it's very much set in kind of a small town, Americana. And it kind of all starts off with a botched robbery that ends up in a hostage situation. And, the whole game is driven by the choices that you as a player make, and they have kind of powerful impact on the outcome of the characters and where the storyline ends up. It's worth saying that, as a player, the game is presented as a series of decisions and quick time events, and you don't really navigate an environment like you would in a traditional game, let's say. It's all very much focused on the story and telling the story. One of the really unique things about Dusk Falls is the art style, and it's kind of this hybridization that kind of 2D kind of character art in this very painterly style over 3D environments, and it comes together. Experiences like a motion graphic novel, so to speak. And worth saying as well, you can play with up to 8 players locally or online as well, and you can experience the game with your mobile phone as well. You can download an app and interface with the game in that way. So hopefully it brings in kind of non-gamers into the fold as well, who might be intimidated by holding a controller. So just a little taste of the game to give you some context for what we're talking about today.
For most people, Turok is just a pit stop. Wasn't taking the scenic route your idea?
But for us, it felt like a trap.
There's enough cash in that safe to put the last few weeks behind us. On the ground, now!
You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. We'd been in the wrong place forever.
Sometimes doing the right thing is doing the wrong thing.
I've got eyes on two hostages.
None of us escaped that night.
It's okay.
Even those of us who made it out alive. Stop! Why are you following me? We've taken very different paths in life. But they all lead back to Two Rock.
Get rid of the cop.
Hey there.
Evening. Hey, Sam.
Say, you haven't seen three fellas in a blue pickup, have you?
Nope. Been here all day.
How you liking the Desert Dream?
Oh, can't complain.
Can I ask what brings you to Two Rock?
Hopefully that gives you a good taste of what this game is like visually. Part one, New Beginnings. Just to give some context for when Soundcuts joined this project, it was in early 2020, and by that stage, there had been over 2 years of active development on the game, and another 4 years before that of just concept work, and where Caroline had the concept and was bringing it to fruition. So at this point, just to give you context, the engine was pretty much fully developed. There was a good framework for the game. All the casting had been done. There was a first round of shoot, and the VO recording had been in place. Some aspects of the game were kind of in vertical slice state. So we knew coming on, halfway through the development process that we need to hit the ground running as an outsourcer. So there's not a lot of time for, pre-production. We need to kind of get it right first time, so to speak. Breaking down the tech specs, as Dusk Falls runs on Unity engine using Wise Audio middleware. And we also heavily use Unity's timeline functionality. And if you've used that before, it's similar to, a video editor. But in our case, we're using it to, trigger various events and states or RTBCs at certain, points in the timeline. And also worth saying as well that our VO is triggered from the timeline as well, and those assets are externally streamed through Wise. There's a pretty complex story framework in this game, as you can imagine, with a kind of a branching narrative game of this type. And that is exported from an application called Artisy, which is something for authoring kind of branching narrative storylines. So it provides like a really, solid scaffolding for the entire game. As you can see here in the top left, this is, what we would refer to as, our fragment view, which is kind of the smallest entity of linear content. Each one is represented by a timeline. And these can string together in various different ways. A fragment could be, a quick time decision, or a decision or a quick time event, or some action within the game or choice that the player makes. And those fragments are grouped into larger subsets called chunks, which are maybe more divergent paths that the player can take during a gameplay session. And those chunks are grouped into episodes, of which there are 6 in this game. So early on in the process for us, it's really important to identify the challenges that lie ahead, just hopefully so we can kind of mitigate some pain. And the first one that kind of jumped out at us really was this really unique motion graphic novel style, and we knew that we'd have to approach this in a very kind of considerate way from an audio point of view, because it's and kind of have quite a novel approach, and we knew that would require a little bit of prototyping to get it right. Also, then, it being a complex project structure like this, we're dealing with over 4,000 of these unique fragments, which can range from anywhere between 1 second to 1 minute in length, if not more. If you line them up end to end, it comes out at over 6 hours of material. For context, it's longer than the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy combined, and it's a small team, so we know that we have to make everything kind of economize in the way that we approach doing this, so we can be as efficient as possible. Yeah, and 7,500 unique VO lines as well as that. Then, for anybody who's worked in audio, keeping audio in sync with picture. Straight off the bat, we know that this is going to be a challenge. If anybody's worked with cutscenes before, that sometimes they're the things that kind of come to, solidify later on the production process, and often there's changes being snuck in kind of, just before it gets to release. Essentially, this game is 100% cutscenes, so we had our work cut out for us. Strap in. Finding a balance then between the kind of interactive and the linear audio conventions was important. Our brief for this from Interior Night and Caroline, was very much finding that kind of compromise, or bringing in people from both kind of aspects, both gamers and people who are used to just watching Netflix, and bringing non-gamers into the fold. And we wanted to make this experience feel familiar for people, both gamers and TV watchers. So part 2, seeing with your ears. I'd like to just break down kind of the visual style so we can kind of understand what we're working with here. Fundamentally, all of the 2D character art is kind of digitally hand painted, I guess. And before that can be completed, there's a live shoot where actors, perform their roles in costume, and then, select frames are chosen from that footage and used as reference for the 2D art. And it gives the artists, an opportunity to focus on particular character expressions and really help tell the story and find the character expressions that kind of convey the mood. And it was a very flexible style approach to tell this kind of story, which is quite vast and branching as well. It all comes together in this kind of motion graphic novel style. So there's no fixed frame rate for the character movement. It really depends on the scene, whether the scene is like a slower paced scene or a faster paced scene. The frames can change everything from maybe 0.5 seconds in faster paced to maybe every 4 seconds in slower paced scenes. And then to add a little bit more complication on top of that, all of these 2D character art is set against 3D environments. And then to add further complication to the mix, some elements within the scene are fully animated, like you see in this GIF here. There's a train in the background. Things like doors and certain props as well are fully animated. So for us, it's important to kind of define, some kind of a style guide, and a lot of this is informed by, what our, I guess, our design document is. But also worth saying that, these things evolve over time, and what you're seeing here is kind of more the evolution of what we settled on via trial and error. And one of the first points really is, we really wanted to make this game feel grounded, gritty, and realistic, leading into those kind of TV conventions. And a lot of our inspiration was more so we'd like to do TV shows like Ozark, Breaking Bad, and some of the Coen brothers works as well. Taking inspiration from television more than games, I guess, in that sense. Probably the key point for us is, our implementation of sound effects, Foley, emotes, etc., should really feel seamless and seamlessly link these kind of static shot frames together, and the end result being a fluid and cohesive player experience. And that was really important for us. The idea behind it was we wanted to create the illusion of movement where it wasn't necessarily always represented on screen. And the whole title of this talk, Seeing with Your Ears, really alludes to a kind of a radio play style approach, where we're using these kind of anchor points, these static points, where the shot frames change as a kind of a sync reference. And then in between those points is where we do all of our kind of meaty storytelling, I guess, as audio designers. And the idea being that we help the player interpolate between these kind of images, creating a seamless experience. And yeah, in many cases there are no objective sync points. So our approach to it is actually more driven by feel than an objective, this is the right way to do it, or this sound is in sync. And one of our Foley editor, Greg Lester, did a really good job in kind of getting a good feel, a kind of a holistic methodology for like how the cadence of footsteps and how like that helped convey flow throughout the scene and breaking up this kind of this static imagery and giving you a sense of movement. Then on top of that, we really wanted the environmental audio and the ambiences to feel kind of rich and immersive, kind of more taking that leaf from the game audiobook. And we were really lucky to be able to work with a field recordist called Diane Hope. One of the other things is that like this game is set very much in real locations, and she's native to Arizona. I think she was able to go out onto our back doorstep and record some really good ambiences, which we tried to use. Then subtle VO processing and very detailed emotes to help ground characters in the scene and enhance verisimilitude. One of the things we discovered early on is like if we went too strong on the kind of environmental processing with reverbs and etc. on the VO, it really created like a detachment from what you're seeing and what you're hearing. So we kind of ended up paring a lot of that back, being a bit more drier, a bit more subtle. But along with that, we use a lot of emotes. We got all of our actors to record like big sets of emotes that we could use as we saw fit, and that kind of goes back to that idea of kind of seamlessly tying all this imagery together and really helping convey, the emotions that these characters are going through in these scenes. Then music and cinematic audio should blend seamlessly to create suspense, tension, punctuating key moments and narrative. We were lucky to be able to work with a composer called Forrest Swords, who provided essentially a kind of a library of score for us, a kind of a palette that we were able to kind of chop up and use as we needed from scene to scene. And it was kind of broken into like key moods, like, action or romance, etc. And then there were sub moods off of that, like action, angry, action, suspense. And it gave us a lot of options in approaching this on a kind of a scene by scene way, because scoring to pictures simply wasn't an option in a game that branches off in so many different ways. And in addition to that, then, the kind of tone of the score is very much kind of rooted in kind of Americana, very rootsy, guitar driven. And we kind of added to that as well with a lot of tension beds and risers and drops that we kind of crafted from. I set up kind of a stereo array of guitar amplifiers and just created lots of crazy feedback and textures. And we used that kind of set of recordings as a really just a library that we could dip into and use to create like a common thread throughout the game to really kind of give it a sonic signature as well. And then finally, subtle UI and auditory player feedback, which becomes part of the soundtrack, but never distracts from the narrative. I think it was very important for us to make this game not sound gamey in many ways. And you can kind of fall into that trap with overuse of kind of auditory player feedback, or UI sounds, if you will. So most of our UI sounds are kind of derived from the soundtrack itself, using like percussive elements from the soundtrack. So they kind of blend in and become more of a psychoacoustic thing rather than, sit up and take notice. Now, that said, there are a couple of key moments where we break that rule, and where there are key choices that the player needs to make, where they actually do need to like sit up and take notice, and it results in very kind of divergent branches. That's where we do kind of duck away some other elements of the mix and say, okay, here you need to make a decision that's important. So I'm going to just play a quick clip that hopefully illustrates some of these points, from the sound effects and the emotes implementation to the ambiences and some of the UI as well.
Well, I'm going to take Zeus for a walk. Vince, would you mind joining me?
Didn't we just walk a mile?
Well, he has to pee, and I want to talk to you about something.
You go ahead. I'm going to stay.
Can I come?
You're the one I was really hoping for.
Thank you for staying. I know I'm irritable when it comes to your dad.
Don't worry about it. I had you back in the car earlier, didn't I?
So yeah, hopefully you get an idea for how all of these elements kind of come together. Part 3, naming conventions and how to make them work for you. So I really had to struggle to not make the entire talk about naming conventions, because it's I hope some of you share my passion. We'll get to that in a little bit. But first I kind of wanted to break down like what sets, as Dusk Falls apart from, some of the other games that we might be used to developing as audio designers, like what I call mechanics-based games. So an example is, where you control a player character and can navigate freely throughout an environment and interact with it. So often games like this, character audio would be linked to, specific gameplay actions or animations on keyframes, for instance. But we didn't really have that luxury as Dusk Falls, because essentially there are no character animations, so we can't drive audio from any animations. Similar to that, in mechanics-based games, you would often have shared sets of assets, that are reused throughout the game. If you take an example of a walk cycle, you'd have like maybe a random container full of footstep events or Foley, for instance, that you're using in various different contexts throughout the game. Whereas, our approach is one more linear approach, where we really need to do bespoke Foley and sound effects and music and emotes for pretty much every scene. We had a very talented Foley artist called Frederick de Vanley, who is based in Paris. And he essentially, recorded Foley, performed Foley to every single fragment in the game. And it took him a while to like get his head around the art style and finding like the right cadence for performing Foley. But I think it really shines through. And then the interesting thing like about a lot of mechanics-based games is, and where we as audio implementers like attach our audio to mechanics, often the mechanics can change and the audio will still work. In the example of a walk cycle, again, if you've made allowances for it, if the walk cycle speeds up or slows down, the audio can still, function correctly. Whereas the kind of equivalent for us is like pacing changes with cinematics. They will almost always break our audio, and we'll need to go in and readdress, various scenes. So that being said, settling on like a workflow that is actually going to, pay with dividends and make things efficient for us is quite important. And our initial design actually assumed that we would trigger the individual sound effects and Foley events, etc., directly from the timeline at the point in the timeline where they would need to be triggered. And it quickly became really apparent that was just going to be so cost prohibitive from a time point of view, from a workload and asset count bloat would have just been such a problem. And then already in a project like this, where the asset count is quite high, simplifying it was in our best interests. So we really kind of leaned into a more linear approach, where we could simply translate picture and have the sound effects and Foley and emotes, etc., trigger, or core sounds, what we call, trigger from the first frame of every fragment. And that the trade-off there is that, once again, if the cinematics team do come in and change things, we get nothing for free, and it's likely going to require resyncs. So I'm sure some of you have seen this mug before. I think it really kind of elegantly describes the descent into madness that an audio professional can go through as the project draws to a close. And like, I'm certainly guilty of this myself. And I try in every project that I do to kind of mitigate this chaos. So making your naming conventions work for you. We were actually, because of how rigid this project structure was, we were kind of afforded a maybe unique opportunity to have the names of our assets not just be names of assets and actually perform a function. So before we started on that, kind of our day zero approach to setting up the WISE project, we really wanted the WISE project to have basically a one-to-one relationship with what we're seeing in Unity, so that they're really kind of intrinsically linked and they mirror each other in structure in this hierarchy of kind of episodes and chunks and fragments. So we had, their code team and Interior Night spit out this JSON document for us, and I wrote a Python script that kind of parses that data and can generate a whole bunch of work units, basically. And then with a little bit of jiggery-pokery in WISE, we've kind of got our project structure with hopefully no kind of human error involved that we don't need to go in and tweak later. And with a project on this size, this process took, less than a day to set up, whereas I think it probably would have taken an entire week, if not more, to actually set it up manually. Then our process, our workflow, on a day-to-day basis, there is a PC which basically runs through the entire game and plays it, captures it, captures fragment per fragment, and then exports them as separate videos with the names of the fragments being the names of the videos, which is very useful for us. They are kept in a kind of a centralized location that we all have access to. Then our wonderful technical audio designer, Jake Baston, wrote this amazing RIA script, which essentially imports all of the videos into our Reaper sessions, and it creates regions and markers for them, does all of the kind of cleanup, but then it can act as like a way to keep the Reaper sessions in sync with the Unity project. So we update it on a daily basis. And once you run the script, it will add fragments that have been added to the project, remove any that have been removed, or notify you of any kind of changes if you need to move a fragment from one chunk to the other, for instance, things like this. And this process in itself just sped up our workflow so much and allowed us to really get an accurate reflection of the exact state of the Unity project, even though we were working in a kind of an offline way. And then the simple part for us then is just track laying to picture. That's what we do for a living as sound designers, and that was easy. Sorry. I don't do then, the other great thing about Reaper is, exporting from Reaper is really flexible with its wildcards, and we had a custom wildcard string, which drew in from regions and marker names to track names and the name of the session. We create this custom string, basically, which is our file name. And probably the kind of novel thing about our approach to this is that this file name acts as an address, telling the file where it needs to live within the hierarchy of the WISE project. And once again, we were afforded this opportunity to be able to do this because it's such a rigid structure. And Jake, once again, wrote this custom importer using WAPI, actually, coincidentally, that parses the file names, tells them where they need to go in the WISE project, puts them there, sets up events if necessary, and also will flag issues. If for any reason there are, file names that it doesn't recognize, we can identify those issues early on. So the pros and cons of this approach is for those who are like me, who like rigidity in naming convention, it just forces asset naming consistency across the project. Because circumventing this in any way would just take you too much time to bother implementing it manually. So this is the path of least resistance. It speeds up workflow. It just became such an efficient workflow for us and allowed for faster iteration times, which became really important later on in the project when things get a bit chaotic. The other thing as well, with Soundcuts, we're quite a fluid team, so we have a lot of team members come onto projects and switch between projects. This allows for faster onboarding for newcomers, where they don't have to learn lots of different things. It's a whole automated process that's taken care of for them, so it's simple to generate assets and just get them in the game. And then it assists with debugging, as I said. You don't have to test so much in the game. You can kind of trust in the fact that you've implemented and it should work, hopefully. Also, it actually helped us flag issues that are further up the chain, where certain file names that weren't parsable by WISE with different characters and things, and then certain times where there might have been duplicate fragment names, and it helped us identify those, which we could feed back to the rest of the team. The drawbacks of this, because it does take time to set up this kind of pipeline, but for us, the juice was worth the squeeze. And it really may not suit the needs of every project. Once again, it's a very rigid project structure, so we were able to kind of capitalize on this, but certainly it wouldn't suit every project. Part 4, bridging the gap between linear and interactive media. So yeah, as I said, our core goal here was to make this game feel accessible to both gamers and TV lovers alike, and for it to feel familiar. So breaking down kind of an observational kind of a rundown of what we're used to as consumers of television and games, and some of the kind of standards in audio that we become attuned to. And just to point out, this is a very general kind of list, and there are many exceptions to this. But generally speaking, we are used to very dialogue-centric mixing in television, where the dialogue is front and center, and it is the kind of framework for which the rest of the mix hangs off of. But in games, it really does depend on the game. There are so many different, approaches to this, depending on like whether it's a racing game, first-person shooter, soccer game, whatever. It really can depend what the kind of focus of the mix is. So as gamers, we're used to a whole kind of different range of approaches there. Similarly, in TV, ambiences can often be quite static and mix quite low as well. Like I did quite a lot of critical listening before I sunk my teeth into this game and looked at a lot of kind of TV, such as Breaking Bad. And like you would be quite surprised at comfortable listening volumes. Like a show like Breaking Bad, the ambiences can often, be so quiet to the point of inaudibility. And it can be quite surprising. You expect them to be a little bit higher often. But in games, we're kind of used to, ambiences being pushed higher in the mix. And I think, a lot of games where you can explore environments, we really want to be able to approach a tree and hear the wind, rustling through the leaves, and we kind of want to enhance immersion. So we're used to that convention now a little bit more. TV, Foley is often, rarely the focus, often subtle, just to ground the characters in the scene. Whereas in games, there is a tendency now towards often kind of hyper-realistic Foley, where it can become the focus of a mix. I chose Jedi Fallen Order here because that kind of is a recent game that stuck out in my mind as having like the Foley almost becomes a voice in itself, and it really kind of nicely conveys the movement of the character, and it's so like centered in the mix, and it's almost its own character. So from our approach, how not to do it. My first approach mixing this game was, okay, I'm just going to mix it like a TV show. And that just didn't work. Like emulating a TV style just does not always translate for interactive media. I think what you have to understand is like TV is tailored for a passive audience, and we as gamers, want to be actively engaged in the game. An interesting conversation that I used to have with actually Matthew Florian sitting down there was about like the difference in perception that you have when you're holding the controller and you're actively engaged in playing the game, the difference in perception you have of like the soundscape. And often, like if you compare that to the experience of your buddy who's looking over your shoulder, experiencing the same thing, sometimes some of the sound can seem a bit odd or out of place when you're looking over your buddy's shoulder, but just feel right when you're holding the controller. And that's something we were really kind of conscious of in this game, particularly because essentially everybody's holding the controller here. So our hybrid approach is kind of taking a little bit from both camps, really. And VO, we've really leaned into like a linear approach where VO processing firstly is baked, which gave us a lot of control over exactly how we wanted the VO to sound. And Steve Brown, our VO editor, did like such a good job in like just crafting these and making them sound like awesome. They're also like really front and center in the mix and in the kind of surround field as well, and mostly in the center speaker. Very few occasions we do some kind of panning as well, but for the most part it follows those kind of linear conventions. Then leaning into the game style approach for 3D ambiences then, and they're kind of mixed higher. We wanted these locations to feel a little bit more immersive, get that player engagement, give the player a sense of like the location of the camera within the scene, particularly in this scene here, which is the motel, which is where kind of the whole storyline kind of kicks off. We really wanted the player to really understand this location and give a sense of where everything is. So we kind of peppered these environments with 3D ambiences, with a 2D kind of ambient bed as well underneath. Then mixing to emphasize key moments of interactivity, such as QTEs and decisions. And this is kind of going back to what I was saying about the difference in perception when you're holding the controller. And yeah, we wanted to make it feel like, player input actually meant something. And that, that the player was affecting the world in some way, particularly when there is like an action that a character had to perform or decisions that had to be made that resulted in some audio. So we would often make those elements a little bit more hyper-realistic. And then, this game, it's quite dynamic in its kind of narrative content. There are very quiet moments of, intimate kind of dialogue between characters that are interspersed with, pretty visceral action scenes. And we kind of wanted to make it like a grunge song where the quiet parts are quiet and the loud parts are loud. And yeah, like the kind of game audio approach is like we wanted to increase that dynamic range so that, when it does kick off, that the player kind of jumps out of their seat and goes, oh, holy crap, what's happening, So yeah, I'll give an example of some gameplay here that hopefully illustrates some of those points that I'm talking about for your viewing pleasure.
If you two didn't want me to come, you could have said so.
Zoe wanted you to come.
Please, Jim, let's just take it down a notch and try to get through the next 3 days.
Without me talking to you, man.
Hey, I'm glad we're spending a few days together. And like I said, once we get settled in the new
Zoe,
Are you okay, Pumpkin?
What happened?
she's just shaken, I think.
Great. Hey, thanks for coming back. If you give me
Learn how to drive, asshole!
Are you kidding me?
Country kids. Or a desert version. Lucky we're still in one piece.
Hopefully that gives you a little idea of what we've been talking about. I'm going to wrap up here with some kind of tidbits and like little bits of wisdom that we gleaned along the way. I call this section coping strategies for endless iteration. Yeah, like the elephant in the room here is that, like, with the game being fully like 100% cutscenes, what do you do? How do you remain sane? Our approach to this was firstly front loading what we consider to be the important stuff. And what I mean by that is, the quality of the sounds and trying to get the mix in early, even if the visuals weren't all there and the edit wasn't all there. And allowing ourselves, the freedom of when the edit does follow, like finally solidify, that it just becomes, a case of doing resyncing. And that kind of applies to music as well, where you try to get the music in as early as possible to hopefully inform some of the decisions, with other team members like cinematics team, which can hopefully mitigate, a couple more rounds of iteration if they got a sense of the pace of the scene. So yeah, this was really important for us, taking that radio play style approach where we are essentially creating the entire soundscape and, then going in and doing our kind of sync work after. And then on that, making resyncing a trivial mechanical task was just the most important thing for us. And that goes back to going back to our workflow, where we tried to just eliminate the amount of clicking that you had to do resyncing and making that a really streamlined process. So that, when there are last minute changes that, you're not kind of saying, no, I can't do that, I don't have time. It's simply that, yes, we can do that. We want to be as accommodating as possible, particularly as an outsourcing team as well. Okay. Staying informed of changes coming your way is also important. Communication, of course, but things slip through the cracks as well. Like Interior and Night were a really good company to work with from that point of view. They were very open, but as I said, it's impossible to track everything. So we wrote some automated systems to basically compare, current fragments to the previous iterations, notifying us of whether they've been modified, fragments added, removed, etc. I can't stress enough keeping it simple. We often kind of overcomplicate things in game audio, particularly with implementation. Keeping it simple basically means that you have to do less iteration. And in a game like this, less maintenance rather. And in a game like this, the less maintenance you can do, the better. And then similarly, allowing for expansion and contraction as well is very important in the implementation, and that goes into music. Making the music implementation flexible enough to deal with any cinematics that come, your cinematics edits that come your way. And then finally, just to wrap it up, more of a philosophical note, above all else, remain calm. We were kind of afforded that opportunity because, as I said, Interior Night were very accommodating, and they were a great bunch of people to work with. But I think, you can get wrapped up in it sometimes, and sometimes you just need to take a step back and say, I work in game audio, everything is okay. Okay, so that's my talk. Thank you, guys. I'd just like to thank... I just want to thank everybody on this list, basically, from Adele to Jake and Steve and Alison, Greg, Lewis, Dave, all of the people that helped along the way, including Sister Music, the music supervisors, Fred, our Foley artist, and Pierre, our audio producer, who, it was just a joy to work with them. It's been such a pleasure to be able to lead this project. So thank you. Coming to Xbox Game Pass next week. I don't think I have time for questions, do I?
Go take maybe one.
One question. It better be good.
We've got 5 minutes, so 4 or 5 minutes. We can maybe
Okay.
make questions.
Any questions?
Yes. Is the microphone working? No?
It's on.
No pressure. So you mentioned that you joined late in the process, and I think there's a misconception that in game audio, the audio comes at the end. And I think this misconception comes from the TV and film post-production industry. And obviously your project was very TV and film-like, but in a more traditional game, would you usually join the project sooner and have more influence early on?
I think it really depends on the project. It just, I don't want to go into it, but the circumstances with this project were that we joined kind of midway through production. Obviously, we'd like to be in there earlier, making decisions about pipeline and workflow that could benefit us in the long run. But, that's not always the case, particularly as an outsourcer. So you just have to kind of adapt and, make things up as you go along and be efficient in the way you approach things. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. It was really, really interesting.
Thanks.
Just wanted to ask about how you mixed in artisy in the process, with the kind of building the narratives and stuff, and how important was that to what you guys were doing? Because I saw the flow of all the story, and I know from my experience that gets horrendously complex. So I just was interested to hear about that, if that was possible.
Yeah, there's a long answer to that, and a long answer. In terms of artisy, we didn't have a lot to do with it, to be honest. We were kind of on the back end of that. That very much set the structure for the kind of this branching node-based kind of graph that you saw. But from our point of view, yeah, there were a lot of complexities, and particularly there's certain parts that can loop back on themselves, and decisions can branch in unusual ways. The really tricky thing is we essentially had to do everything in a very bespoke way and approach it on a kind of a context by context way. So there's some scenes we have very unique implementations where there's states being set, and it's kind of it's a complex beast, and you kind of need to keep on top of it. That's a very kind of high level answer, but yeah, it's not easy. It's a bit intimidating, but after a while you kind of end up developing a mind map of the game in your head. It's interesting. Shower thoughts.
Do you have time for one more or try? One more? Yeah, let's do one more.
Hey, hello. Just a quick sort of technical question, really. In the moments where you're waiting for a player interaction, how did you deal with those? So in those moments where it's button mash and it can take a random length of time, how did that work with the sort of more cinematic style?
Yeah, good question. So there were very few moments where there's an indefinite pause in this game. I should probably mention that pretty much all of the decisions the player needs to make are timed. So that means that we don't generally need to rely on going to looped audio so much. We would just author our sound effects to be for that length of time. And like, if you cut that off, it would just stop that event or stop that sound from happening. You know what I mean? So yeah, that was in our favor, I guess, that, you know, we didn't need to deal with that so much. Yeah. Yeah. That it?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, thanks.